for today's episode, we thought we would take things in a slightly different direction. We set aside a bit of time today to try to think through a few different pieces of writing that came out before and after the election, to get a sense of how the left thought about and engaged with the Obidient Wave and what kind of lessons the left has drawn now that the election has come and passed. And, in the midst of that conversation, we'll also reflect on, I guess, our own lessons that we've drawn from the Obidient Wave. So to kick things off, I think we should start by reflecting on the pieces of writing that came out before the election happened. So let me turn now to Emeka, who perhaps more than the rest of us foresaw some of the developments that played out vis-a-vis the rise of the Obidient Wave. Emeka, you've engaged with, the set of pieces that we shared, all of which will be linked in the description. Of those pieces, which one struck you as most compelling and why? Why don't we start there?
As simple as that question sounds, it's a difficult thing for me to answer. Regardless, let me say for the before pieces, I didn't quite I wasn't fully convinced by the T-pop piece.
Okay.
Well, T-pop, first of all, is a coalition of the left within and outside, the labor movement, labor centers. Essentially, it was thought through as a way to recover the Labour Party from those who had hijacked it. At once the people we call the National Consultative Forum. So the entry of these guys meant their own exit, and that for me wasn't quite convincing. Especially since it was already a given that the Labour Party, as presently constituted, wasn't a revolutionary party in that sense, But so I found the Marxist.com article a bit more compelling. More compelling because it recognized the dialectics of the situation, and it advocated more for, having recognized the fact that you had a Labour Party that had been hijacked by people who didn't quite believe in the revolutionary potential of the party, or people who weren't as interested in a revolutionary party, so to speak, So you had them on one hand, and then you had the labor bureaucracy, and by that I mean the TUC and the NLC, who have also been, over the years complicit in selling out, the interest of workers. So you had them on one front, and then you had the bourgeois elements who had come into the party a couple of months before the election, spearheaded by Peter Obi himself, and his band of co-travelers. I think that the Marxist.com piece kind of recognized the dialectics of the situation, and then advocated for a clear-headed entry, into the Labour Party on that basis, with a body of program that was more focused on workers and the interest of workers. So I think that they recognized the Labour Party as a site for struggle, and that one that should have been pushed in the lead up to the election, I also found the essay, I think it was Basil Abia's essay on Africa as a country, a little bit compelling, where he advocates for some sort of increasing by the left, and in that essay he mentions TPOP, I think. Yeah, and their foray into trying to recover the Labour Party, but was a bit disappointed in their exit, So I share that sentiment. But where my own point of departure with him is, I'm not sure how much how much ideological clarity he had, in his analysis of the Obidient movement, that was basically the motive force of the Obi campaign, because he kind of thought that there was a possibility of radicalizing, if not all, then some of the members of the Obidient movement, almost as if to say that the constituent members of this movement didn't have any ideological grounding of any sorts, so for me, I think in that regard, I didn't quite find his own piece compelling from a strategic point of view, because the elements that you wanted to radicalize were already stuck, were already grounded within a certain ideology, and would have been almost impossible to shift, And then, of course, moving away from that, you then had the post-election analysis.
So let me come back to you for that. After we get OAG to comment on the pre-election analysis. But before we go to OAG, let me ask you to clarify one point that you're making. So basically, it sounds like you're saying the people who seemed most compelling to you are the Marxists. The people who seem least compelling is TPAP, and then Basil was kind of in the middle. If I'm hearing you correctly,
pretty much, yeah.
Like, you were sympathetic to some of his points, but then maybe didn't fundamentally agree on strategy ultimately. But okay, it seems like one way in which you differentiate Basil from the Marxists is that you say the Marxists were pushing for entering the Labour Party with a kind of programmatic focus.
He didn't quite,
right.
It didn't strike me as though he understood the fact that the makeup of the Obidient movement was largely middle class and that they were already stuck. I hate to say it, but these were for large swaths of them who had just come out of the PDP, or would usually go with the PDP.
Right. I totally agree with that last point, but I'll come back when it's my turn. But now it's going to be OAG's turn. OAG, let me come to you now. Can you assess these three pieces from the perspective of, how you were swayed or not by the analysis vis-a-vis how the left should engage with the Obidient Wave as it was rising?
I think, to me, generally, the Marxist one seems to, work with what we have at the times now, something that's a bit more attainable in terms of, like working with the Labour Party, seeing that elements that are really dedicated to the, ideology of the left, try to gain hold of, this Labour Party and make something of it. So I'd say that the Marxist.org one is the one that really does it for me, in terms of advocating, we going in, working with what we have, in a principled fashion, and trying to see, such that whatever happens, we would have already kind of reconstitute or give some sort of direction to where the Labour Party is supposed to be or where it's supposed to go, and use that to educate the people, And then somewhere in the middle is the Africa is a country one, the entrism piece, that one somewhere in the middle. We know, we just enter, do what we have to do. But again, like when we enter and just don't have a program or not have like a focused direction, because I feel generally that the left itself needs to unite under a certain umbrella and not dissipate itself, doing different things. The socialist workers article, that I read, of course, this post-election, points in one direction, and some people are pointing towards entrism. Some people are pointing towards what about coming to analyze what we have at the moment, what's obtainable, and seeing that, we can fix and salvage what we have and go in a certain direction whereby, if nothing, we'll have attained a higher level of consciousness and use it to mobilize the people, or maybe make it clearer for them to see that, oh, this is the new direction that we have to go to. The time might be short, in terms of how things played out with the emergence of OB. I know, I'm sure it was a very, very fast, set of events or occurrences, but we're supposed to be able to adapt and be politically active. And this goes to the point whereby the left is supposed to be organizing with or without elections, so that we're active, we're ready, we have on the ground connections with people, so that when you want to mobilize people for political action, it won't be when you have a new, sort of political talk from the top, then you start running helter-skelter to look for your modality or how to approach it. You also have to direct the course of the country, or its politics, or play an impactful role before it seems like the elites are shaping the action, because then it's already too late. So I'm somewhere in between. For me, the most compelling one is the Marxist.org, one that of course gives an historical background, how to go about things, that one does it for me generally. And
Right.
that one does it for me. Let me let me cap it at that for now.
Okay. I mean, before we let you off the hot seat, we'll come back to SWL, that one that you alluded to, because that analysis was post-election. And like I said, we'll talk some more about that in a moment. But I wanted to hear your take on the TPAP article and the TPAP approach. So it sounds like you were more compelled by, like Emeka, you were more compelled by the Marxist.com article, which, by the way, was written by the Marxist Alternative people. It's an organization in Nigeria. And like Emeka, you were somewhat sympathetic also to Basil Abia's argument in Africa as a country. But how about TPAP and their approach? How does that strike you? Or how did it strike you?
Like a third force that's coming to, build up from the scratch within the confines of, will I say, remnant labor, or people that are affiliated with labor, just recalibrating and bringing themselves up together, which still feels more like running after the boss to me. It feels like running after.
Feel like it. That's what it is.
So that's what really just kind of put me off, with it, because we have to be realistic. The time frame is short, and how do we intend to fashion out something new with that short period of time? And again, you don't just coalesce people around and say you want to do something. We have what's it called? This person we interviewed. Ayo Ademilu alluded to the fact that there are some, people with questionable characters in TPAM, that are still tied to the bougie elements. So are you taking the masses for a ride? Are you trying to, are you trying to distract them? Are you trying, what's the long game being played there? It just kind of gives me some sort of vibes that I don't know.
If you know go call names, leave them. Leave her. If you don't want call the name, we call, leave them.
We can just free them. But then we can just free them. But something like that, really.
Right.
I go rather, we'll just walk away till we get and stop running after the boss.
TPAP gave you the heebie-jeebies. One could say.
Yeah, you can say so. Yeah.
Baba,
Yeah.
let's if we're going to call a spade without calling names, right? I don't think that TPAC has the moral right to call the NCF, the National Conservative Front, or allude to it being opportunist in any sense, really, because if the bureaucracy of the labor movement has thrown the left, outside of the labor movement under the bus repeatedly, then where did this idea of forming a coalition with them, come from, to the extent, So, I mean, without even any insider gist or without having listened to Ayo, it just comes to me. I mean, that's the feeling that I get. That, I mean,
Yeah.
you upped and walked away from what is essentially a laudable effort because you couldn't get the reins of leadership, really, and that's just
Yeah.
how I see it.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's how I interpret, all that long to range, to be honest.
Right. So that's interesting. I think okay, you guys have gone. Maybe I should then take the floor and try to, assess these articles as well. I probably actually end up in the opposite camp than you guys. Um, when it
Awesome.
comes to, yeah, when it comes to trying to make sense of, how these various left perspectives, compelled or not, vis-a-vis the question of how to engage with the Obedients. And I'll tell you why. So I think I found the Basil Abia article least compelling for sure. For the reasons you've already said. Like, it basically was saying a fundamentally contradictory thing. On the one hand, it was saying the left is too disorganized to carry out any serious electoral strategy. The left is inchoate, it's various organizations that don't see eye to eye. And on the other hand, it was advocating for that same left to unify within moments and forge an entryist strategy within the Labour Party. So, I mean, your premise, your kind of assertion is undermined by your premise. How can that inchoate left that we all know is disorganized then carry out a coordinated entry strategy effective enough to convince these former PDP people that Emeka has talked about, the PDP middle class Obidients, to now somehow support a left agenda within a Labour Party dominated by the person they joined the party for? So, I mean, it just seemed like, okay, where are they? What's the head and what's the tail of this approach, really? So there was a certain, I appreciated his having written the piece, and I think it was particularly important for him to write it because a lot of the left was talking for youth, but we didn't really hear a young person speak up. So as a young person himself, I guess he's young. I mean, I don't know him, but that's my assumption. It was good that he wrote the piece. But at the same time, I think it also revealed a certain amount of naivety based on what Emeka has said, that yeah, no matter how smart you think you are or sound, these middle class elements that are joining the party support Peter Obi not with an empty head. I mean, they're not just going to be swayed by your grammar or your stats. They have an ideological commitment. So, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've already said that the left is very inchoate. So how is that inchoate left then going to pursue a kind of strategic entryist agenda? So yeah, I couldn't really make heads or tails of how his read of a certain situation was then informing a strategy. And I think to a lesser extent, this was my problem with the Marxism, the Marxist alternative assessment as well. That I think the assessment was premised on the idea that the youth and a certain layer of workers were moving into the party, so the left should orient itself towards the party. It's like, based on that argument, the left should orient itself towards the APC and the PDP as well, because both of those other parties also have youth and a certain layer of workers. So if we're saying that there are three parties led by the bourgeoisie, which have a base that is constituted partially by youth and partially by some workers, then what really distinguishes the Obidient movement from the PDP and the APC? And we all know that the answer is not ideology. So they're trying to answer that they're trying to argue that the answer is demography or sociology, right? It's the kind of the makeup of the base. But the thing is, the makeup of the base is that different. I'll give you a chance to respond in a moment before I finish. But so if it's very similar bases.
Before you finish, if you just allow me to talk, but after you finish.
Okay, I allowed you to finish. So
no, I'm just joking.
Right? So if it's like in either case, we're faced with a base that looks fairly similar. And I think if you go back in history, this is the same kind of strategic error that led the Marxist alternative people to support Buhari in the 2015 election. Because they, in that instance, similar to this, just saw a popular candidate coming to power, supported by some wing of the Labour Party and seemingly winning the heart of some youth, and assumed that this is where the left should pitch its camp. But if that's always the case, then we're always going to be actually chasing the bus. I mean, to use analogy, right? Because it's like wherever youth and some workers are going, irrespective of what the leadership looks like, irrespective of what its ideology is, we should follow. And so, that kind of leaves me with the TIPAP analysis, not because I feel like I'm completely on board with TIPAP's approach. I mean, I'm kind of similarly wary of some of the kind of underlying political alignments that seem to go on behind the scenes with those folks, which Ayo alluded to. But I think that unlike the other people, they actually developed theory based on practice rather than coming up with a theory in a box and then, trying to kind of template that theory on top of a messy situation. They got involved in the messy situation and used their involvement to formulate a theory. So I think that's an interesting approach. And what was that involvement about? I mean, and that's where I might differ from them, is that fundamentally what they sought out to do is to reconcile warring factions of the Labour Party. Okay. And when they did this, right, after those warring factions were reconciled, those warring factions teamed off and sold the Labour Party to basically this entrance of the highest bidder, in effect. But the question for me is, like, what did TIPAP extract as a concession when it played that game with the Labour Party? I mean, because politics is give and take, right? You gave them this alternative dispute resolution platform for them to resolve their differences. But what did you get out of it? Did you get any strategic position in the party? Did you get to include your programs in the manifesto? Did you get any kind of institutional leverage? So, I mean, I think that approach by TPAP takes us further because it gives us a concrete example of a real life practical application of theory. Okay, let's try to actually intervene in the party. It's just that the intervention they chose, I don't think sufficiently extracted a necessary concession to move politics forward. So, I mean, in all, I think to summarize, why I see TPAP as slightly more compelling than the others is that they did the thing the other people were suggesting, and they did it in real life, not just on the pages of of journals or newspapers. And that thing failed because it wasn't sufficiently backed up by a real understanding of the give and take nature of politics. So it's like the others were just kind of writing in theory, oh, let's move into the party en masse, but which mass and who's us? And let's sway Obidients to our side. But how are you going to do that? They already have their beliefs. Or let's align ourselves with the party in a vague way. Okay, but what does that mean practically? TPAP at least had a practical answer, even if it was the wrong one. So I think that's why I found that one most compelling. But anyway, Emeka, back to you. Sounded like you wanted to challenge this even in the midst of its formulation.
Challenge and die. I want to end on
all right.
To the very roots. Right.
Good.
Okay. So if I understand what TPAP is, right, it's basically a movement formed by people within labor, but on the fringes, and people, the left within labor, but on the fringes, and the left outside labor, right? This coalition was useful because, and the way that's my reading of it, because the elements within labor could call a meeting between the bureaucracy of labor and heavyweights on the left outside of labor for them to have a sit down and try and resolve whatever dispute. But I'm not convinced that any dispute was resolved to start with. Okay? But much more than that, what that suggests to me was that essentially that was a top to bottom approach. Now, part of TPAP's criticism, and by extension, the labor bureaucracy, was that there was no real, and part of the reason why they wanted to resolve this dispute was to make it, to smoothen the road or the grounds for a mass movement of workers into the party. So you basically just had a Labour Party without a base in terms of workers within it. And these were the arguments that were ongoing, right? So as far as I'm concerned, TPAP lost the battle. Obi and Obidients wasn't even their problem. Their problem was with the labor bureaucracy. And it is essentially because they had nothing to bargain with. You know, just calling a meeting for the sake of it doesn't give you any bargaining power, right? Let's even assume that you reconcile the warring factions. Okay, what are you then bringing to the table in terms of numbers? How many associations of barbers, hairdressers, vulcanizers, pepper sellers, market women? What is it that you're bargaining with, really? Okay, so let's take it for granted that they did resolve any
Okay, but
dispute.
that's the point I was making. That yeah, they didn't take anything away from that dispute resolution. So are you agreeing with me in essence? So
No, I'm just saying. I'm trying to what's the word now? I'm trying to contextualize what it was that they did or they said that they did, right?
okay.
And I'm saying this because I think that the fallout that TPAP had with both, I don't even think they had any fallout with Obi, the NCF, right? I think the NCF was just an excuse for them to walk out, because essentially what became clear to TPAP was that with the entry of the NCF, which had money, there's no need to mince words about this. The NCF came with money to mobilize, put money in Labour Party. And of course, the Labour bureaucrats, which had always sold out because of money, had just seen that, okay, these guys came with money, would align with these guys because there's money to be shared. Or these guys look like, okay, that's maybe their own understanding of what the problem is. Money to conduct an election, to even give them some kind of fighting chance against the already established parties. Now, money was the bargaining power that NCF and Obi himself came into the Labour Party with. So it was at the point of NCF, Obi, and the Obidients coming into the Labour Party, it was basically a contest about power. Who would lead the Labour Party? Who would command? Who would gain access to the commanding heights of the party? Right? So as far as I'm concerned, practice, I don't see any practice there. There was no real organization of workers outside, the workers that TUC and NLC provided leadership for. You're right. And I mean, Saeed, you know these numbers. How many are they? Are they 10 million of them? Are they 3 million? Are they 4 million? within Labour or the TUC. But large swaths of the Nigerian working class happen to fall outside of these guys. And I'm not going to say that there's no real organizing going on outside of it, but I'm going to easily say, I mean, I can be, people can come after me for this. But the left as I know it, I mean, it had its heydays, but as it presently constituted, is lazy. You don't have money, but you don't want to put in the work. So there's no practice here, really. At the end of the day, how I interpret what TPAP did was just a clash of egos, really. While with this bourgeois guy, because he has money coming to the party and then hijack it. That's basically it. Okay, because of our ego, we're not going to. But there were other things that could have been done for work in order to rescue the party, which didn't mean electoral victory, which could have meant that even after the elections, there could have been grounds for contesting power within Labour Party.
Right, but did the other authors suggest any of those other things?
At least those ones had a bit more clarity about these things in terms of the ideology. They knew from the get-go that the makeup of the NCF, Obi and his Obidient movement, was largely middle class, right? And they didn't have any illusions about it. They didn't think that they could radicalize them like Basil thought, right? They also didn't think that they had no illusions about the fact that the labor bureaucracy was going to sell out. Okay, right? But what they held out was the hope that there will be elements, right, that would have been swayed by the idea of a third force. They didn't know what the size would be, but that they had this idea that there will be elements that would have been swayed that weren't necessarily Obidients, or who didn't basically believe in the labor bureaucracy, or didn't come out of unions, that the labor centers led. And I think that what this election shows is that no matter how minute those, because it's really hard, difficult to quantify those numbers, but however minute those numbers are, they exist within the people who voted Labour, who didn't buy into the Obidient thing.
Well, okay, maybe we should give OG a chance to respond since you've had a bit of time. OG, do you want to respond to my? I didn't even intend for it to be provocative, but my characterization.
I don't see it as provocative, because we are just trying to make sense of all these things, and what could have been done, how to approach it. What I just feel would have just been better was that if Labour had been a bit more organized and understood the character of that NLC, the Labour Union and all that, Labour Party, if we don't already know, as it take be, say it's no good for the people generally, then what could have been done to have an alternative arrangement? Not be say we will come the scamper, they run to make something out of something we no good to start with in the first place. We will have that's my is the left coherent enough to make a self-assessment of itself, its standing, its political standing before and even after elections, and then to see its fighting chances when elections don't reach, and even after election, what work is being done to mobilize, So I know we won't give ourselves too much stick like that, because we just try understand all these things. But what should be done now is that, okay, elections don't go now. Elections have gone now, Abi?
Yeah.
And they still courts, we still they push on, they talk on and all that. But what kind of arrangement? What is the character of the left? What are our fighting chances? What are the reserve of people we will get? What kind of organization of people do we want to have? The informal sector is a key area that we should look into. All these kind of things should have popped up. And then we should now go back to the drawing board and rearrange for the next fighting chance that we have. It's not that, the thing will go now, then election will come again, they will come dabaru the people and confuse them, and we'll be running and doing this analysis again, So that's my own view about
Sure.
it, you know.
I think
Yeah.
we'll get more into that aspect as well when we
I
come
want
to
ask one
think about
question. Una
when
no
we
need
come to.
answer am, but
Sorry, Emeka, 1 second. Yeah, you've just been going. So I think we'll come back to what OAG was just saying in the next segment when we talk about the pieces that analyze the Obidient Wave after the election happened. Because a lot of that, what OAG is saying, is kind of forward-looking. But before then, I guess, I mean, Emeka, you had a chance to offer some comments on my feedback, and now OAG has just done so. Should I comment, or do you want to say something first?
no, you got. I just want to ask one question now, rhetoric. So I mean, I don't even need an answer for it, because I mean, the way I would have believed what TPAP was saying, maybe more, is if they had decided to go and link up with AAC.
Right.
Yes, that would have been more convincing.
Sure.
More practical. Yeah,
So
something more
again,
practical.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I certainly agree with that, and I wanted to even, start my response to your response by saying one of the things that I most agree with in what you said after I spoke was that the TPAP approach was fundamentally top-down, as in it was oriented towards working with the leadership of the Labour Party, the warring factions, and the leadership of the labor unions, but not really working from the bottom up, which is maybe the kind of approach that, say, AAC has been taking, or others like or to a certain extent, trying to work from a local government level, rather than at the level of national leadership. So yeah, that, in saying that I found TPAP's article of the three we're discussing most compelling, I think I should make it clear that that doesn't mean that I endorse the TPAP's approach. I mean, or that,
yeah, that's good to
or
see.
that, I mean, I hope it was obvious to you guys, but I mean, I think maybe in case it was lost, it's worth reaffirming that.
It wasn't lost. It was just a position that allowed for more rigorous debate.
Exactly. Yeah. But where I still think their analysis has an advantage over the other two that we were talking about is to the extent that their thing was not just theory. The other people were just theorizing fundamentally still. In Basil's case, it was bad theory because it didn't even address the class realities we know about or the ideological realities we know about. In the case of the Marxists, you could argue that there was some good theory in there. At least it had that historical perspective. At least it had that class perspective. But then what was the concrete action that they were ultimately saying we should do? They've talked about how the left is divided. They've talked about how the bourgeoisie is pushing this neoliberal agenda. They've talked about how the workers are likely to betray any kind of left alliance. So then how do you make the left intervention in labor that they were suggesting? And that how question crucially remained unanswered. Then to me, the value of the TPAP approach is that it gives us a how that failed. So at least we know that let's not go down that path, right? That path has failed, which I think is something that if we're trying to be quote unquote scientific, we require, because not all scientific experiments will be successful experiments. You could argue that, okay, well, in fact, we knew before the fact that labor would betray TPAP and embrace the NCF. Yeah, but then we can't have a fundamentally defeatist approach towards the labor movement, right? Because then where would that put us? And even in a context where the labor leadership, itself has shown that history of aligning with PDP billionaires or APC billionaires, they were facing a new kind of pressure in that moment, given the suffering that people had undergone under Buhari, which we talked about in the last episode. So I think from that standpoint, that experiment still had a high likelihood of failure, but at least the attempt has let us know, that that's not the approach to follow, even in moments of high pressure on the leadership. So from that standpoint, I feel that just because it actually gave us a little more of a practical demonstration of, in a sense, what not to do, it had a bit more of an advantage. And the final thing I'll say, in terms of what commends TPAP approach to me is that it, I think, dealt with the fundamentally pessimistic reality that I think OAG has also been alluding to. That after the primaries had already happened, if you want to call them primaries, because in a sense, the APC and PDP primaries were at least somewhat more democratic from the standpoint of people actually voted for alternative candidates that ran against each other, whereas the Labour Party primaries just had one person running. I mean, the other people magically disappeared. But I mean, after the primaries happened, I think TPAP's analysis is clear on the fact that there was absolutely no chance that you were going to come from the top of the party and have any impact. And there was also no chance that you were going to mobilize or kind of re-educate or re-conscientize the Obidients. So, which is where I think the Basil article and the Marxism.com article spin in circles. And I think TPAP was a little clearer on the fact that, look, the party had already sacrificed or handed over on a platter of gold all of the institutional leverage to these right-wing entryists. So from there, what are you doing there? Like, you want to go into the party and be preaching Marx to Lekki people, or you want to be trying to drag the institutional positions that have now all been filled by Obi allies, So I think that maybe the other articles, in a sense, could have learned a bit from TPAP's approach, which happened in a moment before the possibility of actually gaining some power was foreclosed by the end of the primaries. So that would be my response to you guys' responses. Should we open the floor for a couple more comments before we shift to the post-election analyses from the left?
And for our listeners too can give their opinions too, so it's not just going to be us alone, so they can give feedback and all.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
Feedback welcome. I was just going to say, sorry.
I would wager that this would draw some feedback.
One hopes.
Yeah, it'll be nice to hear from them too.
Okay, so you guys want to shift to the post-election analysis then?
Yeah, I think we should.